All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second lecture in our lecture series. I'm not going to make any remarks. I'm just going to tell you what our new schedule for the lecture series is, because we made some changes. And behind me, you actually see the new schedule for the lecture series. So for those of you who were here last time we had Tom Palom, who was giving a critical reflection on planning in Florida. Today we'll have Robert Yaro, and Charlie will introduce him shortly. We then have, Charlie was going to talk actually on November 30. We've moved that up a little bit. And Will Sonneveld is going to come on January 18, and he's going to talk about visualization and visioning. And then Alan Thierstedt is going to come on February 22nd, and he's going to talk about value-added spatial development. So as you know, last time, I tried to watch Palom's lecture again. And I was surprised at how much I missed the first time I was watching this, and how much more there really was in his lecture. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, I wrote this down, is Palom said, a rethinking of Florida's planning system is very much in order, especially after what he considered a legislative session that was an outright disaster. And he asked himself, what will rise from the ashes? And the answer is not going to come from Tallahassee. And what I hope we will hear today is a possible solution. We have Robert Yaro here talking about New York and New Jersey, the RPA. So with that, I don't want to spend any more time. Charlie, if you could please invite our speaker today.
For me, this is a really special treat. I've known Bob for a long time. We've crossed paths, mostly in the Northeast in various projects. I have always admired his contribution, and so we started thinking about rethinking planning in Florida, and Bob was number one on my list of someone I wanted to bring for two perspectives. One is experience and perspective on regional planning, and also his involvement in what I call a non-traditional planning sponsor and the role they've played in New York. He's the president of the Regional Plan Association, founded in 1922, America's oldest independent metropolitan policy, research, and advocacy group. I think the first plan was 29. Yep. And has continued. Based in Manhattan, the RPA promotes plans, policies, and investments needed to improve the quality of life and competitiveness in the New York metropolitan region, America's largest urban area. The support they have brought to that region economically is in the order of a lot of money. He co-chairs the Empire State Transportation Alliance and the Friends of Moynihan Station, and is vice president of the Forum for Urban Design. All of that is a mouthful, but it goes on, and I think it reflects his remarkable talents and his contribution. He serves on Mayor Bloomberg's Sustainability Advisory Board, which helped prepare Plan NYC 2030, New York City's new long-range sustainability plan. Since 2001, he's been a professor of practice in city and regional planning at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also taught at Harvard University and the University of Massachusetts. He holds a master's degree in city and regional planning from Harvard and a bachelor's degree in urban studies from Wesleyan University. He's the author of numerous studies and publications, and is really one of the most acute believers and understanders and leaders in planning in our country, and I'm so proud to have him here at Florida Atlantic University.
Okay.
I'm supposed to
Turn that one off, right? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
Charlie. Thank you. Well, it's really nice to be here, Charlie, and I've admired your work for as long, I guess, as you've been watching my work in the Northeast. And of course, John DeGrove was an extraordinary contributor to our business all over the country and in the New York area as well. So it's really nice to be here. And Florida, for so long was the pioneer in greater than local land use regulation, as John used to call it when he would come and lecture with me at Harvard. And it's interesting to be here at a time when Florida, is no longer in the vanguard and is in a position, I think, to rethink where it wants to go with its planning system. And there's just nothing like the bucket of cold water that you've gotten with the economy in South Florida, which is probably in worse shape than in most of the country. And hopefully, that'll be the the element, I guess, that leads to a rethinking of the planning system here. And as we had a conversation with Charlie and Yap before I got in here, and I made the point that, well, the bad news is that the state legislature and the governor seem to, at least for the moment, to have walked away from a commitment to state and regional planning. And that's the bad news. The good news is that leaves a vacuum that allows you to rethink how you would like to reform the planning system, and how you want to think about the future of the South Florida region and of the state, what we call the Florida mega region, essentially the area from Orlando south that functions as a single integrated economy, and but doesn't think of itself as being a part of the same place. And the reason that Charlie brought me down here, I think, is that I've been involved in the smart growth business from the very beginning. When I was a professor at the University of Massachusetts, I ran a research center at the university, and we started the first smart growth program in Massachusetts, and came up with the term smart growth and so forth. And so obviously interested in talking about what that means in a very different political era. But I think primarily what Charlie had in mind was having me talk about the idea that a civic group like Regional Plan Association can provide leadership and continuity on regional planning issues, and can make a difference in a political environment in which the politicians don't play well together. But given, and I'll go through a slide presentation, and then I'd like to open this up to discussion, and I'll do a case study about regional plan. And we have been around longer than any other regional planning organization in the United States. So we've got a track record, and you can go to our website, www.rpa.org, and take a look at what we're doing now and what we have done and so forth, and form your own conclusions. But I'll talk about what we've been up to recently, a little bit of history about RPA, and then I think talk about the implications for South Florida and where you might want to go. So a regional perspective is our logo, and this is home. It's and if you think things are complicated with a 3-county region here and 104 cities and municipalities, it's really complicated in New York, because we've got 3 states that don't always share the toys and don't play well together, and you know, this accident of history that Charles II in the 1660s decided that the Hudson River would be a very convenient place to put the border between New York and New Jersey, which means that literally a half-mile west of City Hall in New York City is the border between the 2 states. And that essentially requires that these 2 states collaborate in a way that they might not otherwise have had to. I mean, it's the center of the biggest urban region in the Western Hemisphere. And then I live in Stamford, Connecticut, which is 29 miles from Times Square. It's in a 3rd state, and that's because in the 17th century the British Crown kept pushing settlements down the Connecticut coast to get as close as they could to New Amsterdam to keep the Dutch from moving east. So this accident of 17th century colonial rivalries and politics has left us with a political geography that doesn't match the economic geography or the mobility systems or the natural systems of our region. You know, this is not an unfamiliar story to people who worry about regional planning anywhere. And one of the interesting things is that Americans, you know, we used to think of ourselves as the most progressive and, you know, pioneering place, and we weren't restrained by the history and the institutions and classism and so forth of the Europeans, so we could keep adapting ourselves and reinventing ourselves. And ironically, we've become the most cautious and conservative, small c, and risk-averse people on earth. And you know, we're stuck in New York, and you're stuck here with a set of political boundaries that are seemingly unchangeable. And I'm always interested when I go to visit my friends in the UK, in the United Kingdom. They've just completed their 3rd fundamental restructuring of local governance since the Second World War. You know, wiping away counties and shires that have been around for 1,000 years. And we can't get Broward and Dade to collaborate in new ways, you know. And you see the Europeans collaborating across, you know, whether it's the Dutch or the Belgians, you know, collaborating with the Germans, or the Italians collaborating with the French and so forth. Countries, they've been at war with each other, killing each other for 1,000 years, and they're able to collaborate on planning issues in a way that we could only imagine doing. But that's the challenge before us, because I think part of why we've been able to do that is that since 1890, when the GDP of the United States surpassed that of Great Britain and Germany to become the preeminent economy in the world, for 120 years we just have not had to look in the rearview mirror at what the rest of the world is doing until now. And now we clearly need to pay attention to what other countries, what other regions, other urban regions around the world are doing. We had a conversation with the dean and with Charlie before we started, and I was in Sao Paulo a few weeks ago, and Florida's always thought of itself as the economic capital of Latin America. Well, I got bad news for you. The folks in Brazil are really rethinking that, and Sao Paulo sees itself as the economic capital of Latin America, and they are investing and reforming governance, reforming institutions. They are dealing with the fundamental issues, quality of life issues, mobility issues, housing issues, and so forth. They have big problems. A quarter of their population lives in favelas, these informal settlements, but they're doing something about it. And we're just sitting here as though we're on top of the world and we really don't need to reform anything or invest in anything and so forth. And I think the answer is that we really do, or we're going to get run over by the competition. We're going to find ourselves hopefully a pleasant backwater, but maybe a not so pleasant backwater. Anyway, a little bit of the history about RPA. We've been around since 1922. Since '99, we've gotten $75 billion in infrastructure investments in our region, mostly in transit, and it's actually a little bit more than that. Since put this slide together, we adopted a new MTA capital program and a regional payroll tax to invest another $20 billion in our transit system a couple of years ago. We've protected 1 million acres of open space. Charlie's been involved in some of that in the Jersey Highlands, and the whole network of big regional landscapes, watersheds, estuaries, and so forth that we've been protected, and we've focused on improving the design of communities across our region, from Midtown Manhattan to small villages at the exurbs of the region. We are different than most other civic groups in that we're called Regional Plan Association because we develop these long-range strategic plans for the future of our region that address the major policy and investment concerns that the region needs to deal with if it's going to continue to succeed. And we're beginning work on a 4th regional plan that I'll talk about briefly at the very end of the presentation that would have a target year of 2016, 20 years after our 3rd regional plan was completed. And I'm just going to go through, we have a broad range of programs in housing and economic development and community design and environmental protection and sustainability and so forth, but I'll just talk about 3 issues that I think are germane to the issues that you're dealing with here in South Florida. And the first one is how our region competes globally. For most of the last 100 years, New York didn't have to think about that. Things came to New York, and people came to New York, and institutions came to New York, but we're not taking that for granted any longer. We're assuming that we're going to have to hustle to compete with a growing number of world centers who would like to clean our clocks, and we see many of these places as peers, but we want to learn from them as we move into our 4th regional plan. The growing issue, a national issue of growing income inequality. I guess if you think about the Occupy Wall Street crowds, and I have considered joining the Rev and going, I've been down there a few times now to talk to people about it, about why they're there and so forth. And as a former long-haired protester in my youth back in the 60s, I had long hair in those days. Harder things have changed. But I think the fundamental thing that people are most unhappy about is the growing sense that there is this growing divide between rich and poor, and a hollowing out of the middle class in this country, and a government that isn't doing anything about it at the national or state or regional level. And so we're looking at and again, one of the things about RPA is that we work with federal officials, we work with state officials and city officials, but we don't assume that they're going to do things for us. Or if they need to do something for us, our goal is to help them understand why they need to make investments, and then build a base of political support for moving ahead, or policy changes and so forth. And then finally, climate change and sustainability, which I think at one discussion with John DeGrove, I said, I said, well, maybe the answer to growth management and sprawl in Florida is to wait a few years. You know, we got more than any other place in the country. Large areas of South Florida in particular are very low, close to sea level and so forth, and things like sea level rise, the heat island effect, changes in rainfall patterns and so forth have the potential to do an awful lot of damage here. So that's something we're dealing with, and it's something obviously that you need to deal with, and you can't do it at the municipal level. You got to do it at the regional level or the mega regional level, the next scale up of regional collaboration. So we ask ourselves these questions, and RPA. One of the themes that has run through RPA's work now for almost a century is that unlike a lot of other planning groups who might be thinking about how to pull up the drawbridge, or you see this a lot in county plans, how do we manage growth, which really means keeping those people out. What we've always done is to start with a set of population and employment and land use change forecasts to figure out what's coming our way, and then to figure out how to manage it. And so that's a big part of what we've done. Our region has almost 24 million people. We're planning for a region of close to 28 million people by 2030. We're growing, and we're continuing to grow even in this economy. It's a little slower, birth rates are down and so forth, immigration's down a bit, but we're still growing. We have the same, these themes, and it's a little, the analogy I use is the one, every spring my wife comes around, with a bucket of water and a bunch of sponges and things, and says, it's time to wash the windows again at home. And I said, well, I just did that last fall. She said, yep, 6 months, time to do it again. And one of the things about regional planning is that each time we've done one of these regional plans, we've addressed a set of issues around congestion management, or affordable housing, or providing an adequate potable and safe water supply, preserving big natural systems. Well, we've done these in each of our plans, and in our 4th regional plan we'll be dealing with it again, because these issues don't go away. So all of these issues are issues that we have come back to over and over again during our almost 100 years in business. So here's this is what's driving Plan YC, the city's sustainability plan. It's driving our 4th regional plan. Where do you put almost 4 million additional residents, 3 million jobs, and so forth. And the key here is that rather than looking at population growth and employment growth as a problem, and it is an issue for us, because New York City and the region is probably more built out than just about any other place in the country. But we look at it as an opportunity, because if we can harness the energy and productive capacity of new residents and new industries, it gives us the tools and the wherewithal to manage all of these other issues that we might not have the financial or economic resources or fiscal resources to deal with. We get down and dirty, and not just thinking, starry-eyed thoughts about what it would be nice to be in 20 or 30 years, but rather, how do we make sure that all of the big infrastructure systems, many of which RPA helped create going back to our early work in the 1920s, how do we create capacity in all of these big systems to accommodate the growth that we know is coming, and to do it in a way that makes the region more efficient, more livable, more economically competitive than it is now. And so, we started with this transit system, and our 1929 plan laid out about half of the subway system, a big part of the regional rail system, and so forth. And we had this very lucky coincidence that our second president was a guy named Fred Delano, who conveniently had a nephew, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the governor of New York and then later the president of the United States. And so our first regional plan, it doesn't seem like a fortuitous thing to finish a long-range regional plan 5 months before the stock market crashed, but that's what we did. But it laid out what today would be $500 billion in investments that were largely built during the Great Depression, both with local resources and state resources, but also with WPA and all the other federal programs. And so we're doing it again. And in our 3rd regional plan, we laid out a set of regional rail improvements inspired by the RER system in Paris and Tokyo's regional rail system that proposed integrating elements of our regional rail system, creating new capacity from the east, from the west, and north and south, and so forth, and All of this was under construction until about 10 months ago when Governor Christie pulled the plug on the ARC Tunnel. And after we'd started construction, I really have never seen anything quite like this. And we attempted to convince the governor, but it was a little like what Rick Scott did with the Tampa to Orlando high-speed rail project, where I think it was as much politics as it was the fiscal concerns that caused him to pull the plug on the ARC Trans-Hudson Tunnel. But RPA, we're now in the midst of a study of Trans-Hudson mobility and working with the Christie administration and underpinning the reasons why we need to move ahead with a new tunnel under the Hudson River, new commuter rail and intercity rail tunnel. And so one of the things about regional plan is that the governors come and go, and this lovely civic group goes on. And so we are working now to lay the foundations for a slightly modified version of the ARC Tunnel that would be completed, several years later and after Mr. Christie leaves office. But the others are under construction. They will collectively create the capacity that we're going to need through 2030. In our transit system, we expect to be able to accommodate about 80% of the mobility needs, the trip generation, the extra population and employment will create on the rapid transit system and the commuter rail system as opposed to the highways, because we know we're not going to have a lot of new capacity in the highways. We've done research on the impact that these transit investments have, and remarkable benefits both in terms of mobility, but also the economy and livability of our region. And these are the additional benefits in terms of property values that improved transit service creates. Now, we tried to use these statistics to convince Governor Christie. It didn't quite work, but we're hard at work with our other two governors who get it, and I suspect that in the long run, that project will happen. We're doing things like figuring out how much capacity we need in our airports, all of which are landlocked, and then how to create it, and working with the Port Authority and with the political leadership of the region, with the airline industry and other stakeholders. We came up with a long-range plan, for the airports that will add a new runway at JFK, or possibly two runways at JFK, new runway at Newark, and a whole series of other initiatives that will create about a 40% increase in the capacity of the airports by 2030, and then also reduce congestion. If any of you have flown into New York, you probably know that you never know when you're going to get in or out of one of the New York airports because of this congestion. We work in our regional centers. We developed a concept for New York as a polycentric region back in the 1960s, probably 40 years before London and Paris started thinking of themselves that way. And we've been hard at it for all of that time, so almost half a century now in promoting growth in our regional centers. And we do drop out of the clouds. We work very closely with each of the regional centers. I mentioned, as I mentioned before, we have 900 municipalities, and we don't try to work in all 900. We focus on probably 40 or 50 of them, which is where 95% of the growth is going on and where the action is. And in particular, in this network of regional centers stretching from Midtown Manhattan in the upper left-hand side to places like Newark in the upper right-hand side, and then a smaller centers around the region. And this is one illustration of how we work. In our third plan, we identified the far west side of Manhattan as a third central business district. Midtown was filled up before the Trade Center bombing. We had no place to build in lower Manhattan, and so we proposed the creation of a third business district, a transit extension on our number 7 subway line to provide transit access to the area, with a proposal for, in the end, it's going to be 50 or 60 million square feet of new office buildings and 100,000 new residents and all the rest of it. It's almost the size of downtown Washington, D.C. or Boston. And then our new mayor came in, Mike Bloomberg. He heard about the concept, and he was peddling an Olympic plan for 2012, and the mayor's office decided that would be a terrific place to put a football stadium. And we did a whole bunch of things. We brought the mayor of Barcelona over. Our mayor admired Barcelona's Olympics, said that was the model for how you do an Olympics that can be transformational. And the mayor of Barcelona, Pasqual Maragall, in a breakfast with the mayor, Gracie Mansion, explained that this was not a very good idea, putting the stadium on the waterfront. We had a difference of opinion. We're pretty good at figuring out what the process is for getting things done, and for the process for, on occasion, not getting things done. And there are all these groups, that most civic groups are NIMBY groups. They are organized to oppose things, and we, on occasion, do that maybe 10% of the time. This is a place where we had a difference of opinion with the city. We said that they ought to build this major new mixed-use complex on the waterfront on this air rights site. Turned out to be owned by the state of New York, and we convinced the Speaker of the State Assembly this wasn't a good idea, and he vetoed the project. And I mean, literally the next morning, or I think it was a few days later, I had breakfast with the mayor, and they said, now what do we do? And I said, we're going to go ahead with a major mixed-use development, Mr. Mayor, and we're going to find a location for the stadium in Queens, which is probably where it should have been in the first place. And didn't get the Olympic Stadium happened. The Mets are very happy there, and now the mayor considers this development on the right-hand side, which is being done by the related companies, Hudson Yards development, to be, you know, his preeminent economic development achievement. And we consider that to be too, because one of the things about Mike Bloomberg is that he's a very practical guy, doesn't hold grudges, and you know, when one door closes, another one opens with him, and he's ready to move ahead. So that's happening. We've dropped out of the clouds. We're dealing now with the issue of why things cost so much to build and operate in New York. Why does union construction cost a third more? You know, we've just done this big study of, you know, mapping the industry, which no one had ever done before. You know, our staff, they felt like cultural anthropologists going into sub-Saharan Africa to understand the culture of the construction industry. Very, very convoluted set of folkways and traditional practices and so forth that were adding billions of dollars to the cost of building things in New York. And this led to a series of reforms in the labor agreements that were negotiated last April by the industry, and we're now going back in to keep this process moving. So you do need to not just develop the broad vision, but you've got to drop out of the clouds, and you've got to identify the specific actions that have to be taken. The poverty reduction, again, a really tough issue for us. One of the things that we've done over the years is to, you know, we're probably the earliest supporters, adherents to the idea of transit-oriented development and mixed use and mixed income development around our transit system. We've got 40% of the transit ridership in the country, so we got a head start in doing that. We're now working along with, I gather, South Florida Regional Planning Council is doing another one of these sustainable communities projects. We have the City of New York and 14 suburban municipalities working on a official TOD strategy. We've been pushing informal strategies, but now we've got an official strategy for the region on Long Island and in Connecticut and in the Hudson Valley, as well as New York City. Started as a tri-state deal with New Jersey. They've decided to go on their own. They're doing their own proposal now, and we'll coordinate with them on that. But the goal here is to really move the needle when the economy and the real estate markets come back, to be in a position to have the plans and zoning. You know, we've already got the infrastructure, but we need to have the planning and zoning in place, the master plans and so forth, to promote the next generation of development around the transit stations across the region in a place that's already revitalized its regional rail system. And this last issue, climate change, you know, we've done a lot of work with the city and with the 3 states and understanding what the climate adaptation strategies need to look like. With Irene, a couple of months ago, Hurricane Irene, you know, we had a near miss when we thought we were going to get a Category 2. We ended up getting a barely Category 1 hurricane. It did flood large areas of our region, did a lot of damage, but it didn't do the kind of extraordinary damage that we thought that it might. But a big part of our job is helping the civic and business leaders, as well as the political leaders, understand just how dangerous these storms can be, how urgent a need it is to address all of the likely impacts of climate change in our region. So it's sea level rise. It's things like dealing with the heat island effect. You know, one of the concepts we developed, and it was incorporated into the Plan YC that I'll talk about in a moment, the city's sustainability plan, was this idea of recreating the eastern deciduous forest canopy over New York City. Sounds totally nuts, you know, imagine that, but that's what we're doing, and the mayor embraced this. We're putting in 1 million trees, and when we're done with that, there'll be 1 million more. We've got more white roofs and green roofs than any other place in the Western Hemisphere over the last 5 years. We've totally revamped our building codes and have adopted a city ordinance that requires that every significant building, residential, commercial, industrial, retail in the city over the next 5 years retrofit those buildings to achieve some energy standards in terms of insulation and glazing and so forth. So a lot has happened. Part of our work is educating the public. You know, density is a four-letter word in Florida, and in New York it has been too, believe it or not, that neighborhoods don't want to see additional density, particularly high-rise development going in. So helping people understand that density is the key to achieving our climate goals in New York as well as in Florida, because it means that places that are designed around sidewalks and shoe leather and rapid transit are places where people don't drive every day, and it means that you have more party walls, so they're more energy efficient in terms of heating and cooling and so forth. You know, one of the things we discovered when we started the city's sustainability plan is that the average New Yorker produces only 29% as much carbon as the average American, and our goal is to reduce that by another third over the next dozen years. So another element of our climate program is protecting these big landscapes, the big public water supply watersheds, the highlands that stretch across the Appalachian Highlands that stretch across our region. In effect, are a geneway that will allow species of plants and animals and insects and so forth to migrate north as climate change occurs. So the idea of creating an unfragmented Appalachian Highland landscape that stretches along the whole East Coast is something that we're interested in. We're part of our America 2050 program. We're now working across the Northeast on a coordinated strategy that reaches from Virginia all the way to Maine to take what we've done already in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut Highlands and stretch that out over a dozen states. So that's, and protecting the big water supply watersheds, building resiliency and redundancy into those systems is something that we've been working at. And again, you drop out of the cloud. So we're working in the city on a network of greenways in the city and new public spaces. This is one of them that this was a Coast Guard base and originally a military base going back to the American, even before the American Revolution, Governor's Island. And Coast Guard announced they were getting out in '97. Rudy Giuliani announced that this would be a terrific place to flip to his friend Donald Trump to put up some high-rise buildings. And we said, well, wait a second, we actually could use a very high-quality public space in the middle of the harbor. And I described these 174 acres as a central park, but with a larger water feature. And so this is now moving ahead. RPA convened a group of civic and business groups called the Governor's Island Alliance that has been a proponent now for turning Governor's Island into a new kind of regional park. It will also have a couple million square feet of both existing historic buildings and new buildings that will be devoted to education and cultural activities and economic activities that can support the island. We had several 100,000 visitors this year to the island, and we expect to hit 1 million visitors next year. So it's already become a major destination for people in the city. I don't know if anybody's heard this idea that we are moving into a new era of our relationship with the planet, the Anthropocene epoch, and you know what this means is that we're, rather than preserving nature or standing back in awe of nature, that we're now in a position where we really need to be thinking about reclaiming natural systems and not just protecting but reclaiming, restoring, rebuilding natural systems. And so one of the places where we're, I think, pioneering in this is in Jamaica Bay, which is an estuary in Queens. It's part of the Gateway National Park that RPA helped create back in the 1960s. But we have it's an abused landscape. There's been a tremendous amount of erosion of the wetlands in the bay, and we now have a comprehensive strategy to move ahead with the restoration and reclamation of an underutilized area, and creating kind of a Riviera for Brooklyn. That's the idea. One of the things that we're doing is working with the city and a whole collection of not-for-profit trusts that have been promoting waterfront parks. Over the last decade, we've transformed literally dozens of miles of formerly derelict, abandoned waterfronts into these new public spaces like this one along the Hudson River. And one of the things that we've done is to figure out what the impact is on the economy, the neighborhoods that abut these places, so that we can create a set of special tax districts to support these. So we've been promoting the idea of greenways and public spaces along the waterfront, and then figuring out how to design and build them and then finance them so they can be maintained. And a little more on Plan YC. Mayor, in the aftermath of the Olympics not coming to New York and the West Side, battles and so forth, we said to the mayor that New York needed a strategic plan like the London plan. Mayor got on the bandwagon, and his administration just put everything behind creating Plan YC. It was originally adopted in 2007, updated in April of this year. We created, it's essentially a long-range strategic plan and a sustainability plan for the city, 10 goals, so it's fairly simple for people to understand. The most extensive public process of getting citizens involved in developing this plan and implementing it. And the mayor is a very serious business type of guy, and if you can't measure it, he's not interested. If you can't benchmark it, he doesn't want to get behind it. And so we had, I think it was 116 specific steps that had to be taken to implement these 10 goals, so ranging from rezoning and reinvestment and infrastructure, the goal of having a park within a 10-minute walk of every resident of the city. So we've identified a series of places to implement that, and virtually all of those parks have been developed now. A long-range strategy for the city's water supply, and protection and expansion of the city's public water supply watersheds and so forth. A set of transportation investments, and this was great because the city essentially adopted RPA's third regional plan recommendations and got the mayor and all of the incredible force that the mayor brings to things. So we've got 6 tunnel boring machines working 24 hours a day now in our city, building the 2nd Avenue subway and the East Side Access Project, and building a third water tunnel. This is where we're going to create the capacity for the transportation needs of New York for the next 50 years. An energy strategy that is greening up the energy supply, bringing new gas lines and new electric lines, so that we will need some new energy in the long run, even though we've got very significant conservation measures. And the idea was to reduce the current carbon production by 30% by the end of by 2030, and we've actually gone a little beyond that, and we're ahead of target on this thing with a little help from the economy. So this stuff doesn't stop, but we're now beginning work on a 4th regional plan, and again, it's based on this issue, which South Florida and every region in the country has to ask itself: how do we compete globally? What are the unique assets that we have that allow us to produce goods and services that the world will pay for, to attract talented people and entrepreneurs and keep them here? And I would argue that South Florida's got an extraordinary set of assets that most other places in the world would kill for, and starting with this extraordinary natural setting and a climate. Now forget about July and August, but the rest of the time it's really nice down here. And what seems like a third of New York has moved here, doesn't it? So that's number one, is maintaining a sort of a fresh look at what we need to do to sustain our place in the global economy, a new partnership with other both current and emerging world cities. So we're beginning to work in Sao Paulo and Mexico City and Nairobi and Joburg and a number of other emerging world cities. We will also be working in Singapore and others to understand what they're doing, but then and see what we can learn from, but also to take the best practices from New York and help them learn from us. We think that whenever you do economic development planning in this country, typically it gets down to how much money do we have to shovel at companies to come here or stay here, and we don't think that's really the best way to do things. We think you got to look at the kind of bedrock assets of a region, which are, it's got to be a nice place, and it's got to be an efficient place to move people and goods, and it's got to have an educated workforce, and it's got to have a set of institutions like this one that attract talent, train people, get them the skills that they need, produce new technologies, and deploy them here, and so forth. Those are the things that we are investing in already, but we need to renew our commitment to those things and identify the next steps over the next generation. Bringing millions of immigrants and minorities into the mainstream of our society. It's a big issue in New York, where more than half the population, is now either minority or immigrants, or the children of immigrants, and so forth. I think we've done better than most places because our development is primarily organized around this big transit system and reasonably accessible to these zones of emergence for immigrants and so forth. But we need to do a lot more. climate adaptation, as I said before, is going to be at the top of our list in the fourth plan. And then finally, we're working with IBM and Siemens and Cisco and others, the other big technology companies, on this idea of smart cities, smart regions, a whole new set of urban management technologies, environmental management, transportation management technologies. So we're working with them to demonstrate a lot of these technologies in New York, see if we can get the bugs out of these things, look at which ones really are going to make sense in achieving the goals that are outlined in the rest of this to-do list. And then invite other world cities to come in and kick the curb and see how these things work in New York, and take the best practices and the best experiences and apply them in other world cities. So that's my pitch. There it is. That's the logo. The website is on the bottom of the www.rpa.org. You can download publications and progress reports and all of these things and so forth, and stay in touch with us. Welcome you to sign up to become members. For $50 a year, you can become a member, and for free, we'll send you our newsletter and keep you posted on what we're doing. And I was asked to go to this last slide because this presentation is part of this larger series, which is really about reinventing planning and smart growth in South Florida, and coming up with some innovations, learning from the innovations in other places and the best practices in other places like New York, and looking at how you can adapt these to your own needs. And I'm very excited about what you're doing here. South Florida has the potential, for the second time in my professional life, to be the pioneer, and to I refer to it as South Florida 2.0. Create a whole new, not just a vision for where this region is going, but a game plan for getting there, and a process that says that if Tallahassee isn't going to lead, that the citizens and the business and civic leaders and the academic leaders of South Florida have the opportunity to do this ourselves. And so that's a really exciting prospect. And here you are at the very beginnings of this process. So I hope you'll come to the rest of these sessions. I hope to be back to help you shape this as these ideas come together. So thank you very, very much for listening, and look forward to a conversation. Thank you.
All right, so we have half an hour to engage in a dialogue and ask questions.
Who are your members and how are you funded?
Can you hear me? We have about a $5 billion budget. We have a staff of about 35 full-time people, and then a very large collection of interns, volunteers, scholars, and others who work with us. And the budget, we have, I think it's a couple thousand members, and they tend to be people who care a lot about the future of our region. It's not a large membership organization, but it's a very engaged membership organization. About a third of our budget comes from members, and they range from $50 a year school teachers and librarians and cops and that sort of thing to I think the largest contributions are in the neighborhood of about $50,000, and those tend to be major employers. But what that means is that no contributor puts in more than 1% of the budget. No one interest, no one industry, no one individual dominates the agenda. Another third comes from philanthropies, from foundations. Many of them support us with general support and have for some cases for decades, and others make grants for individual projects. And then finally, we get, it's not quite a third, it's probably more like 20 or 25% in grants and contracts from public agencies. So and typically what happens is that we go to the public agencies and say, we really think we need to do a long-range plan for the airports, or for the transit system, or for for the Highlands and that sort of thing. And then the city of New York or the state of New Jersey or the Port Authority will hire us to do that work in collaboration with them. And what we almost always do in a situation like that is that we will round out the budget with other contributions from industry or from philanthropies and so forth, so that the public agencies don't predetermine the outcomes. You know, and the key here is that we're an independent organization and independent of the politics, which gives us the ability to get ahead of the curve on issues. It allows us to, on occasion, disagree with the politicians when we think that they're wrong, and that's one of the fundamental things that a civic group can do that a public agency cannot do. It's also something that a university can do, for example. And one of the models I think that Charlie and Yop are interested in pursuing or looking at is how can the university play some of the part of the role that RPA plays in New York. Certainly the research can be done here in the university. The convening can be done, which is getting disparate interests together as a kind of disinterested actor. And I've done this in my teaching career, at UMass and at Penn, where we're very active in research, convening, publications, outreach, and so forth. Those are things the university can do, as well as a civic group like RPA.
You had mentioned that your staff had mapped the construction process and found where to save money.
Yeah.
And it ended up being in labor contracts, I believe you said.
Yeah,
Could you
and-
expand on that?
Yeah, and what we ended up focusing on was two issues. One were work rules, which, and I'll give you an example that on high-rise construction sites, the contracts typically said that people worked from 9 to 5, and they'd show up on the site at the ground floor, and then they would take could be half an hour to get to the 32nd floor where they were pouring concrete or building form work or that sort of thing. And then they'd go back down for coffee break in mid-morning and back up again, and then back down at 4:30 in the afternoon to get to the construction hut on at the ground floor at 5 o'clock, which meant that instead of working an 8-hour day, they were really working something more like a 6.5 or 7-hour day. And that was just a traditional practice. We felt I'm sorry, it was a contract provision that simply was inefficient. It's something that a work rule that they'd adopted. We found that a whole series of those things, and then there were other traditional practices that just required on some construction sites, for example, you'd have to have more than one flagman. You'd have to have 2 flagmen, and then the flagmen would have to be there before construction could start. And on a transit project, for example. And so when you added these things up, they added about a third to the cost of doing construction above and beyond, just the base salary that was being paid for. And so what these labor agreements did is that they traded off salary increases for changes in work rules and traditional practices. And so the most disruptive and the least efficient of those practices, are being eliminated. That's really our job, was to point out where, just how big a part of this cost, structure those practices and work rules were. Yeah.
I have a question about the use of the word region in the literature. Region.
Yeah.
Region is used, the same word is used for many different scales.
Yes.
Part of the city is a region, cities, 2-3 cities is a region. You use the region in the metropolitan area context. There is the mega regions.
Yeah.
There is the southeast region of the United States.
Yeah.
According to me, or I believe that this use of the same word for different scales brings kind of ambiguity to regional planning from the urban planning perspective.
Yeah.
Do you think we need to look into this issue more and maybe create hierarchies in terms of how we define regions? And what do you think there are differences? What do you think are the differences between the mega regional planning and the regional planning?
Yeah. Oh man, this is epistemology 101. I missed that class, and so I guess I would argue that don't get too carried away worrying about that. I mean, and I think, way we've defined our region, and it's the it's a big, big, big place. You know, it's 150 miles across, and but what we've always done is we've looked at two things. One is how the place functions. So you know, our definition of the region is in part driven by the commuter shed, by the the distance that people are willing to drive or take trains to get to work, and then in part by the kind of self-identification. You know, we actually went out and we'll do this again for the fourth plan. When we went out on the third plan, you know, we went to see the newspapers, and we basically mapped where the New York Times commuter newspaper shed ended, and where the Boston Globe and the Hartford Courant started up on the northern side of our region, and where the Philadelphia Inquirer started selling newspapers on the southern side of our region. And that was a way of kind of building in a self-identification. You know, it became very clear that if you went south of Trenton, people considered themselves to be part of the Philadelphia region, and they considered themselves to be, the other thing that we found, we were looking at where the fan base came from for the major sports teams, and you go south of Trenton and they're all Phillies fans, and you go north of Hartford and they're all Red Sox fans, and so forth. So there's a self-identification as well as a much more scientific identification that I think is a way to do this. It's what we've always done, and we've used the political boundaries only insofar, where we've organized our region as a 31 county region, simply because the census information is organized at that county level. And so we've kind of taken what we found to be commuter sheds and newspaper sheds and so forth, and then we've adapted them so that they match the political boundaries, just because we can then have access to the Census Bureau information that's just really important when you're doing planning. Mega regions, we kind of began this thing back in 2004. I did a studio at the University of Pennsylvania that was called the Plan for America Studio. My dean gave me a very hard time saying, hey, Bob, studios are supposed to deal with neighborhoods in Philadelphia, not with the whole country. And we mapped population growth and land use change. And the damnedest thing happened when we did these land use change forecasts. It basically looked at 40 years of sprawl. And then we looked at what might happen. We pulled out steep slopes and protected areas and so forth. But then we looked at where the growth was likely to go if the trends of the last 20 years had continued. And what you saw was the emergence of these mega regions. You started to see particularly in the Northeast first, but also South Florida. You started to see South Florida, the northernmost suburbs in South Florida, kind of bumping up against the eastern and southernmost suburbs of Orlando. And the same thing happening between Orlando and Tampa. We started then to map economic relationships. We looked at industry clusters and how things were organized from an economic point of view. We looked at mobility systems. We looked at big natural systems, and that's how we mapped the mega regions. I mean, that was where and we used the term mega regions. My original term was super city to describe these things, and then my planner friends told me that city's a dirty word, and a lot of Florida, for example, we don't want to be a city, we're a suburb, and so we went to mega regions, and I think that's a good way. There's some of these big systems. If you want to look at the biggest mobility systems, or the biggest natural resource systems, when you look at the South Florida water supply system, you have to go to Orlando. You got to go a little north of Orlando to actually pull it all in and start to manage this thing as at a scale that is appropriate. And I think that's where regional planning needs to go. My Dutch planner friend Jaap Motter, you probably know Jaap, uses a term he calls it dancing with the scales. So that's the Euro English translation of what he says you need to do, which is you address each issue at the most appropriate scale. And in some things you're worried about, where to put the street light, on the corner down here. Well, then you need to operate at the neighborhood scale. If you're worried about, how to manage how to manage the water resources of South Florida, you got to work at the mega region scale and everything in between. And don't worry about the definitions. Just make sure you got the scales right.
Hi, I actually have two questions. So you want me to start with the easy one or the hard one? I'm just kidding.
For me?
Give him the hard one, all right?
Give him the hard one?
Yeah.
Well, I guess just listening to you, and I would love to be able to do this on a more regional scale for South Florida, but as I see one of our biggest problems here is mass transit. We just don't really have the support of the people. And probably everybody sitting in this room probably thinks mass transit's great, but we're not the ones kind of making the decisions. So is there any kind of guidance you can give us in a way to kind of address that in the future? I mean, nobody wants density in their backyard, but everybody would love to be able to take, we can't really do underground subways here. It has to be above ground. It has to be buses. It has to be something different than, New York, a lot of the northern cities. And I think we just all struggle with how to kind of bring all those forces, and that's the second question, the politicians together to kind of, so we could get to the point where they would pass like a penny sales tax. So in 20 years, maybe we could start building some of that. So I guess just your perspective on how we can pull together the community enough to get buy-in from, we have 31 cities just in Broward County, and, everybody has their own, interests. So if you could address that. I know it's a hard question, but.
Yeah. You want me to take it?
Well, I'll start it off. I'm a part of this rethinking exercise. I think that one of the ways of doing that is to create a planning construct that doesn't depend on the politicians in the first place to define the agenda and then to control the outcome. And one of the things that attracts me to the RPA is, as a civic club, they have demonstrated over the almost 100 years of their existence their independence. They're an honest broker that brings information, they analyze it, and they distribute it in ways that are meaningful to people who care about their communities, so that when they engage in political dialogue, they have the information, they have ideas. And part of my view is that's what we need in South Florida. Most of our citizens don't even understand the systems we all depend upon. They don't understand the implications of their daily behavior. And we've been so focused on plans that are guiding regulation and not on plans that identify what is our potential role in the global economy and what do we need to do to take advantage of that. And that's what this rethinking concept that this series is focused on. It's not a magic bullet, but and I don't see that we have the time to build an RPA, though I think if we could initiate a planning dialogue through some independent broker, it could be, I look around and there's only one organization, one type of organization that I think can marshal the resources and take a leadership role in creating a new planning construct, and that's a university. They have all the subject matter specialties. They're all busy educating the population who needs to understand things. And what better way to educate people than to teach them about planning than to do planning in the context of it. So I would like to explore, and will explore as a part of this program, how could a university, bringing all their disparate background and experience and their students together to do many of the things the RPA would do. I would hope that out of that would come the sort of private sector involvement and support, a foundation or something that would start to provide additional funding and support. But I think there's a great thirst in our community, our regional community, to understand our systems, know what our opportunities really are, and start building on it. And so that's my perspective of what we need to do. But we have to go back to the basics. I mean, we need to, Tom Pelham's right, we need to get our act together, and then we need to communicate. And I taught a course with Yop this summer, and one of the things we talked about over and over again was planning in terms that are meaningful to the people who are affected, not planning for other planners. Producing products that somebody can understand, somebody who wants to talk to the other people in their homeowners association to explain why they need to stop doing a certain thing because it's contributing to water. Most people don't understand what our sources of water are and how they're used in South Florida. So that's one of my takes. Now I have had a long career of watching this organization. Even I mean 3 of those conservation programs that were on Bob's map, I've had the privilege of being involved in it professionally. But that's what I think, and it doesn't mean I'm not suggesting we displace public planning and zoning, and that's always going to be there. But I'm suggesting that there are ways to inform it in a more objective and more reasoned and thoughtful and more equitable basis among all the collective interests. And so that's my response.
Great answer. I just add that I think your fundamental point, which is that all of this has to be driven by solid research. That I think the public is very, very skeptical about people running off with an emotional issue and and not really understanding what the implications are for their own lives and livelihoods and their neighborhoods and so forth. And so I think that beginning the process with a very sound analysis of what the issues are that are facing this region, what the options are for addressing them and so forth, and then engaging citizens once you've informed citizens about what the issues are that that the region faces, and a good understanding of what the choices are. And then the last thing the university can do, it has this amazing convening power. I mean, I said this before to Yap. As a former public official who then went into teaching and being at a university, I learned that when you're a public official and you go into a public meeting, the presumption is you don't know what you're talking about until you prove otherwise, which happens pretty quickly in most cases. And then, on the other hand, being a professor at the university, and I've done this for 30 years, I teach at Penn now, but I've taught at Harvard and at UMass, and the presumption is you know what you're talking about until you prove otherwise, and that's possible to do that too. So I think the idea that this should be research-driven, fact-driven, help people understand what the impact is of doing nothing. That's something we always do. We're working on a high-speed rail proposal in the Northeast, and for 2 dedicated high-speed rail tracks, very expensive. But the alternative is our airports are tapped out. There's no capacity left in the aviation system. Airspace is filled. So, well, okay, let's build highways. And so the answer is, well, we could build 6 to 8 lanes, additional lanes on I-95 and meet the same needs. And then you go to people in Philadelphia and in Brooklyn and say, well, how does this sound, this idea of jamming another 8 lanes through the Bronx? What do you think? And the answer is never going to happen. And around the world, you go to the United Kingdom, for example, the Cameron government, which is just gutted every other kind of public investment, is moving ahead with HS2, their high-speed rail line from London to Manchester. And they did the same analysis. The alternative was 6 lanes, the length of England through, 8 national parks and a dozen areas of outstanding natural beauty. And every politician that looked at it said, no way, that's ever going to happen. So let's grow up and let's look at something that we can build. And I think that's what you have to do. And high-speed rail, I think something that Florida ought to consider. I think that was probably short-sighted to kill the Orlando to Tampa project. It's desperately needed in this part of South Florida along the East Coast. And it's a high-speed rail that's then integrated. That's part of a balanced transportation system, integrated with bus rapid transit and with light rail and with the other systems that connects to the airports and so forth. So that it's an integrated a balanced transportation system. That doesn't mean that you got to have 6 hours of, rush hour traffic in each direction, twice every day. And I think you go to people with those choices, they're going to say, bring it on, as opposed to I'm against it.
I just would like to make one more point if I can, and that is that I don't think a new initiative has to swallow the elephant whole. I think that a concept, framework that then tackles issues. If you go to Bob's webpage and look, you'll see what they've been doing over the decades in terms of producing programs targeted in the framework of the overall idea, individual subjects that are of importance, and I believe that this plan, Rethinking, instead of doing everything poorly, focus on the big, start with the 10 that are really important, and then pick off one where you can make a difference with public education.
Question for Bob. Charlie, you can chime in too, of course. Assuming there's still going to be local governments that we have to really deal with, it's going
Good assumption. Good place to begin. And there will be.
Yes.
Yeah.
That are going to take all these ideas, these regional ideas, these constructs and things, and assume that they are good ideas. what's the public process? You don't have to get into great detail. This is
Yeah.
sort of a broad question. What are some of the public process ideas that you guys are thinking about when you're launching your 4th regional plan, so that these local governments, begin to feel like it's their plan as well, and they will take some of these ideas and execute them locally? Can you just sort of chat about that a little
Yeah.
bit? So.
Well, as I mentioned, we have 900 municipal governments, and we're a little not-for-profit. So one of the givens is we're not going to have a lot of daily communication with all 900 of them. But what we try to do is to focus on the, it's a little like the original Florida planning system. You focus on the places that have most of the growth, and where you have critical resources that are going to affect the whole region, and you focus on those places. And so, we've gone. So there in our region, we've gone from 900 down to about 50 places that we spend a lot of time with. And I'll give you an example. On Long Island, we've been working with, and Long Island is a place where regionalism is a dirty word, and you've got 109 zoning authorities on this island, and none of them like each other. And they, regional planning on Long Island means putting the dump or the landfill or the auto body shops on the town line, draining into the next town, and so it's not that different than regionalism everywhere else. So I think it's interesting. What we've done is over the years we've held a series of educational programs for mayors and for town planners and so forth. We did a thing on August, which I was around transit-oriented development on Long Island. We're finishing the biggest transit investment project in the history of the United States, which is the East Side Access Project, which we had in our 3rd regional plan, and it doubles Long Island Railroad's capacity into Manhattan, allows for reverse commute from the city out, and intra-island commute and so forth. And no one has thought about until now, well, what does that mean for the I think it's 120 stations the Long Island Railroad has on the island. So what does that mean? And so we brought them together, and we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and we had 25 mayors who said, we're ready to be the guinea pigs. We're ready to change our zoning and adopt other regulations and make some investments that will allow us to do higher density housing. We did a study that showed that there was enough vacant land and surface parking around these stations to accommodate all of the development needs of the island for the next 30 years. Without urbanizing another acre of Long Island, and everybody hates sprawl on Long Island, and they want to protect open space and farmland and so forth. So I think I think it's education. I think it's working with elected officials, treating them with respect, giving them the information that they need to make enlightened decisions. I come back, and I said this earlier. I've been at this for 40 years. I've worked in little villages in New England. I've worked in Manhattan, and everything in between. And I really believe that if you give citizens, and I think I have to see if I feel it local officials, but let me start with citizens. Okay, you give citizens the right information about where their place is heading, and the right information about the choices that they face, the right setting, and where you treat people with respect and you allow them to speak and listen, that they'll choose the right outcome every time. Every time. I've never seen it work another way. And I'm starting to think, and maybe I'm just getting charitable in my old age, but I'm starting to think that if you work, most local officials go into, run for office because they actually they're public spirited, and they do care about their communities and so forth. And I think you treat them with respect, and you bring them in and work with them. Some of them, you don't need to work with all of them, because there are a lot of little bitty places where there's no growth going on, or they're built out and nothing's going to change. So focus on the places where real change can happen. And I think work with the folks. This is my approach. You work with it's where the capacity for growth intersects the political will to do things differently, and work with those places and demonstrate a new way to do things. Might take a little while, get it right in a dozen places in Broward County, and the others will follow eventually, because the citizens are going to say, that's what we want. That works. That means I can walk to the store, or I don't have to sit in traffic all the time, or gee, there's a park down the street, or my kids can get to school. I mean, all those things, that I think in the end everybody wants. So.
All right, just the only thing I'd add is, I think part of our problem historically has been that we've defined planning so narrowly. We've allowed it to be defined as anti-business, as anti-growth. We ignore education. We ignore the economy. There is no economic element of a plan in Florida. how do you know what you need to do if you don't understand the basic economics of the region you're a part of and the state you're a part of? So I really think redefining planning is the first step in starting to create information in a form, in a language that people can understand, and then not worry, not sweat don't count how many people are implementing or following you. Just keep working through the process and let it grow, because I spend too many days and nights in public hearings in which nobody in the room is informed about the subject they're discussing.
I'm proud of it, right?
And so I start there as a teacher. I started as a teacher, and I'm ending up as a teacher, and I really, but it's redefining what we mean by planning. I mean, I used to tell people the best planner I ever knew in my life was my father. He was a retail merchant. Every year he looked at what I did last year. Every year he looked at how much it was going to cost to buy in, and what's going to happen in 5 years, and then he'd make a decision. He'd set out a plan, and then he'd work like the devil to implement it. And that's really what we should be doing with our land or water resources and our human resources. Where are our human resources in the plan? So that's a big part of redefining what we mean by planning. And
You know, I've been using the term, getting away from planning or visioning or these other kind of tired, I've been calling these things success strategies. It's really, what do we have to do for our community to succeed? And I just think, I think this country, and particularly places like South Florida, we've had a body blow in the last few years. The bottom's dropped out of an economy that was, it was not quite slash and burn, but it was about consuming the resources of this place, so we got to invent a new economy, and everybody in this society wants that to happen, and so the next generation of regional and local plans ought to be about creating success strategies. What do we need to do to make this the most successful, livable, competitive place that it possibly can be? And I think everybody is going to rally around that, and it's obviously it's got to be fair and equitable. It can't be just for a few people. It's got to be every community, every income group, and so forth. Who's going to disagree with that? And then I think it's creating a process that gets you there and brings the public along. And the old adage is about Gandhi, I'm a leader. Wherever the people go, I will follow, and so forth. The politicians are very astute at watching where public opinion goes. And if you can build public support, and I do think, by the way, getting business leadership, getting civic leadership, involved from day one, is fundamental to the success of this thing. If you can do that. Because we also have the best government that money can buy, and a lot of these folks have helped pay for it. So if you can get them, involved in these success strategies at the regional and the local level, then in fact I think the political will is going to materialize.
All right, so now I'm going to interrupt you guys for a second. I have told 3 people that they can still ask questions, and we have 3 minutes left.
So rapid.
Neither of us can answer the
Yeah,
question
yeah,
then.
Yeah.
Maybe just putting it out, the question is regarding addressing some issues of segregated neighborhoods that you addressed in your Tri-County area, and maybe giving us some insights on how to approach and help them emerge.
Well, I'll do it quickly. If you go to our website, and we've done a series of projects in very low-income communities that are designed essentially, they've invited us in to help them create a more balanced housing supply, to diversify incomes and housing prices and types and so forth. And if you look at the website, you'll see those, and that's really what our Sustainable Communities project is about. And but one project in particular that we've been working at for several years now is in East Harlem, which has got more public housing than any other, by a percentage basis, any other neighborhood in America. And the neighborhood wanted to diversify the economy, bring in middle-income residents, because people are getting priced out of the public housing. Their kids couldn't live in public housing, and they wanted the services and retail and schools and so forth, and went with market housing. So we've helped them, develop a strategy. It's been built into zoning amendment. Second Avenue subway's going there. We worked with the community to make sure that they get their own subway stop in East Harlem. Also Spanish Harlem, if you remember the song, you know, and it's I think it's been successful in essentially creating a much more balanced community and a successful community. But it's done at the invitation of and collaboration with the residents of that community.
Yeah, you can't go in and tell them what to do. You've got to go in and work with them and help them build their community. I haven't worked in New York, but I worked in some doozies in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
My question has to do with how you use the media to get the word out about what you're doing.
What
how to
media?
reach the public.
What media? We don't have one
Well,
anymore.
we still have one in New York, and so we work very closely with reporters and with editorial boards. The ed boards are some of our closest friends, and you know, and they actually, because again, they like the fact that the work that we do is based on research, it's independent, and so forth. And so we work very closely with them. But it's tougher. It's much tougher because people don't just read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal any longer. They're looking at a dozen different news outlets, and not all of it is fair and balanced either, I might add. And so.
I think it's absolutely essential, though, to any initiatives in South Florida, and it's got to be everything. It's got to be traditional media, social media, and it needs to also have enormous integrity. Its authors must be above any question, any reasonable question. And if so, it will become a source very quickly, I think, and that can have a significant impact. But that's got to be a part of it. But again, that means producing documents, results that are in language that people can understand, who are going to be at the receiving end of those media.
Yeah, obviously it's become a hackneyed this idea of social media. You can start a revolution in Egypt. You could probably start a regional plan in South Florida with social media. But I think we're trying to figure out exactly what that means and how to use Facebook and the others to engage the public in new ways. And there are some new technologies that we're working with some very creative people and new media that combines the electric town meeting model and with with the internet and with Facebook and so forth. So we're hoping to employ those in our 4th regional plan.
The hook?
All right, it's 7 o'clock. If you please thank our speakers.
Yeah.
I hope to see you all back on November 8th, Town Planning Day. The flyers were hanging out hanging on the thing, and then also on November 30th. Thank you.